Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside Leather History, a Fireside Chat. I'm Doug OKeeffe. I'm the host and producer of the chats, which are a program of the Leather Archives and Museum. Today, it's Tuesday evening. It's March the 7th, 2023, and it's a cold evening here in Metro Chicago. But I have the privilege of sitting down today with Rob Rittiger.
Hey, Doug. This is your friendly editor. I checked with our guest today, and his name is actually pronounced Rob Ridinger. That's with a long I and a hard G. Or as he told me, grrr. Carry on.
Who is an LA&M board member and the founder of Trident Windy City. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you, Doug.
Great, happy to have you here.
One slight correction. I was one of the three founders of Trident Windy City.
Good point. Okay.
We'll get to that in due time.
All right. Let's start right at the very beginning, where I like to start with all my subjects. Tell us a little bit about where you're from, your family life, those kinds of things.
I come from a small town about 30 miles east of Pittsburgh, Westmoreland County. It was a town where my family had been since its founding in 1864.
Wow.
One of my ancestors was the Burgess, or the mayor, you might say at that time. We've been fairly prominent. On my mother's side, my grandfathers and his brothers ran the local butcher shop. We were always involved with meat. And my mother was a registered nurse. My father was a cost accountant who worked for Jones and Laughlin Steel in Pittsburgh. After I came to high school, I went to Pitt, took degrees in anthropology and German, then went to Case Western for a degree in anthropology. And then with my library degree, spent 3 years in Southern Africa with the Peace Corps.
Wow. And where in Africa?
It wasn't until I came back to the United States that I met my first master and entered the leather community.
Where were you in Africa?
Hey, Doug. This is your friendly editor.
I was at the National University of Lesotho. If you look on the map, it's a small walnut-shaped country that's completely surrounded by the Republic of South Africa, as South Africa was then known. It used to be a British High Commission territory, and it's one of the 17 poorest countries in the world.
Wow.
And I worked in their National University Library on a recataloging and weeding project, and as they say in the Northern Hemisphere, other duties as assigned. And there was a lot of assigned, trust me.
Wow.
But in the process, I got to travel to Cape Town, to Victoria Falls, and it was a transformational experience, absolutely.
How so?
Well, in the sense that when you go beyond the walls of America, America has a bad habit of setting limits as to what you can be and do. You get into the outer world, and there are no limits out there except those you put on yourself. And especially as an anthropologist, I knew I was moving from one culture into another. So I was aware that when you go there, you have everything to learn again. Not how do we do it in America, but okay, I'm living in a Southern African kingdom. What are the local customs? What are the local answers to life questions? How do we do it here? Not what are my answers from America and why don't they fit?
Wow. What do you think was the biggest lesson you took from that experience?
Patience.
In
the sense that I learned there's time enough for everything. In Africa, you simply could not go at the full pelt of the Northern Hemisphere civilization. You had enough time to do what you needed to, but the pace of life was much slower because it had to be.
Wow.
So you learn to savor the fact of the slowness. For example, one of the things that I learned to appreciate was the fact that every night I could walk out and look up and see the Southern Cross and the arch of the galaxy shining in the sky over Roma.
Wow.
And of course, coming home for home leave was difficult because everybody's question was, what was it like? And my first thought was, dear God, how basic shall I be? Which piece am I going to take?
Yeah.
But it was most interesting. And I'd go back tomorrow.
That's quite a statement. Truly.
Well, because one thing, I just, not because I want to blow the Peace Corps horn, but when you do that, if you open yourself to the experience, you become a citizen of the nation you serve in. And when I came back from home leave, it was very interesting because I've been gone for 2 years. We were just talking December 78. And when I returned, I remember stepping onto a TWA jet, which shows you how long ago this was.
Okay.
Heathrow, having just watched a Concorde take off. And it was so weird. For the first time in 2 years, I was inside a totally American environment, and it felt weird as all get out. I could understand everything everyone was saying. The newspapers in the packet in front of me were the Wall Street Journal, the Northern Hemisphere edition of Newsweek. I remember sitting there looking out the window as we're flying across the Atlantic and thinking, I want to go home. And home was the Mountain Valley in Southern Africa.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I had documents to deliver, and I was going to give a lecture at the University of Pittsburgh's library school, which I graduated from 5 years before. Sort of local boy makes good. And it was so strange to get up and give that lecture in January of 79 because there were African students taking training in librarianship at Pitt at the time. And most of the people were asking me usual questions. Well, have you seen apartheid working? Which lamentably I had more than once. And then the African students asked me a very interesting question, whose subtext was, are you engaging with the culture of the country, or are you playing the expatriate game? And I answered them in the only way I could, saying as much as I could, I was engaging with the culture of the country. And they all started to grin. And I realized an African question had just been asked in an African manner and answered in an African manner. And the Americans sitting in that room had no idea as what had just gone on under their noses.
Wow. Wow.
And then I went down to talk to the editor of an encyclopedia on library science. He had an article on Lesotho in there, which was grossly inadequate. And I said, well, this is, on behalf of the librarians of Lesotho, I would like to object. And he said, well, we're going to be doing a supplementary volume. Would you like to write an article for us? I grabbed the chance because I'd never published anything before, which is kind of funny when you look at the string of publications I left behind me up to this point. And so flying back was a real experience because I got the chance to stop in Amsterdam for the first time. Unfortunately, we did not have time to frolic in Amsterdam. But some of my friends in Rome were Dutch faculty, and they said, if you go to only one city, go to Amsterdam, because everything you want to see is right there in the heart of the city. And they were right.
Yeah.
Then it took me 2 days to fly the length of Africa and to get back to Roma. And when I got back, it was very interesting because I was burnt. I'd been traveling for 5 days. The Land Rover dropped me outside the library. I walked into my office, dug out the documents. I had taken scholarship applications to an agency in New York and returned with the receipts. I walked in, the head librarian and her colleagues were having their morning tea. This is South Africa, after all. And they looked up and all of them started beaming and they all said, welcome home.
Oh.
And so when I came back, I never really left Lesotho. I brought it with me. I brought the lessons it taught me too, which served me well in the living world.
Having to jump a little bit to another topic, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit about your coming out. How did you learn about homosexuality, being gay?
Well, in some ways, the classic way that you did in the 1960s, from books. There was one book on homosexuality in our local public library. By Merle Miller. And he did a pretty good job of it, but I read it through and I couldn't help thinking, yeah, come on, tell me the good stuff. And of course, I started reading more and more, and I put my own answers together by not asking anybody, but by asking the questions of what I could find to read. I didn't really come out until I went to Cleveland for graduate school. That would be the autumn of 1976. No,
Okay.
75 in this book. And one of my professors had told me if I was going to do this, I should find Cleveland dignity. And Father Romano was absolutely right. I found they were meeting in the Hallinan Center on Euclid Avenue on the Case campus. They were very accessible. So I went there, and that's where I met the man who would become my first master.
Oh, okay. How did that evolve for you? Did you learn a lot about the leather kink world at that time?
Not at that point in time, because that was before I'd gone to Africa, but I wrote air letters to him all the time I was gone, because he was a good friend in many ways. And I came back on home leave. I made a point of going to Cleveland to see him. And it became obvious to me that he had a lot to teach me. So when I came back permanently, which would be in 1980, I went to visit him, and we established a relationship. Then I moved out here to Illinois in 1981, moved into the present flat at that point in time, and I've stayed here ever since.
My gosh. Okay.
And of course, it was a very interesting time of learning and expansion. He taught me that I was a leather man. This was a permissible thing to be, and how you were to manage the hungers and different aspects of this identity to keep yourself in balance. The patience I'd learned in Africa was very useful in those years, let me tell you. But at that point in time, I was also going for tenure here at the university. In our craft, you usually have to have a tenure project of some kind to qualify. Basically, the old idea was you have to demonstrate that you can contribute to the pool of scholarship in the field that you're serving in. So I decided to do something which I suppose in retrospect was exceedingly radical. I decided to index the first 15 years of The Advocate. It had never been done. We were getting it here, and it was coming in paper, and you may remember it was a small magazine format. There was this time when they were doing series on individual cities. The student came to me one day and said, I want to research the gay community in San Francisco. And The Advocate had just done a theme issue on San Francisco. So I dug it out for her. I saw her sitting outside my office taking notes and writing things down. And it just hit me. There are thousands of people like her across the country who could use what's in that magazine, and there's no index to it. So I decided I'm going to build an index of the first 15 years of The Advocate. 2.5 years later, I had a drawer full of 12 and a half drawers of cards. And the Advocate themselves had agreed that they were going to publish this. But I had to get the material to them first. But prior to that, Barbara Giddings, who was then running the Gay and Lesbian Task Force in the American Library Association, heard about my project, and she said, well, the ALA conference is going to be in Chicago in the summer of 1985. Why don't you come and be on a panel and talk about your project? Now, bear in mind, I'm not tenured yet. So I agreed to do this. I figured, okay, well, it's a big conference. She has a picture of me for the flyer. Nobody I know will see this. There are thousands and thousands of people coming. It'll be all right. So I go there, I'm at registration, and I'm hailed by some friends from Texas with a, we see you're giving a paper. And very cold. Where did you see this? Oh, there's a pile of flyers right over there. Barbara had put flyers out at every major location, and there's my picture with my theme right under a big sign that says Gay Task Force. So much for the closet door. It was a good crowd. They liked what I had to say, and the one person I remember vividly speaking to me is the late Joseph Gregg, may he rest in peace, of Gerber Hart in Chicago. The first words out of his mouth to me were, where the hell have you been hiding? because no one in Chicago knew anything about this project. Mainly because it was such a good idea, I was afraid someone would nobble it and run off with it, when in
Yes.
fact nobody did. And of course, then of course we had the tenure problem, in the sense that what I had done was controversial. The subject matter. There were those who were for and those who were against, and I worked through the process, and eventually I did achieve tenure. But it took a fair amount of fighting. And I'm not sorry I did. This has been worth it, because by that, I earned my freedom.
I'd like to loop back to your initial forays into some of this. You benefited from a sir that offered you incredible mentorship.
Yes,
Please
I did.
talk a little bit more about that. I think a lot of people desire mentorship. It's difficult to find.
Well, I would agree with you on that, having received it and having served as a mentor to 4 very fine young men over the years. What Master Larry did with me was offer me explanations as well as some very practical hands-on training. Over the months, it was so much more. If I had questions or things I was thinking, things I was feeling, I would pour it all out to him in a letter. He would read it through and send me back, well, you need to look at this, you need to look at that. He educated me very thoroughly. And the best part was, after I had succeeded in having tenure, he came to South Bend for a conference, and I was able to go join him. And so we had a chance to go out to dinner and toast my victory together. And then he flew back to Cleveland to his new partner. But in some ways, he never left me and I never left him. But I had the training he'd given me. Now, mentoring is something I think is important, because so many people come into the leather world, and when the hungers wake up in them, they're not sure where to go, how to go. They're not sure how to put a name to what they're feeling. Is this acceptable? What's wrong with me? I'm such a nice person. How come I want to do X, Y, and Z, or even beyond zebra? And how do I balance that with the person I always thought I was? What I always did with my 4 sons was tell them 3 things. I told them the 3 books they had to read: the books by Joseph Bean and the book by Guy Baldwin. I said, as you read these books, you will gain answers to many of your questions. When you're done, you'll have a list of questions that you haven't had answers to. Those are the ones you and I will work on.
Which
if I don't have the expertise you need, we will find someone, say, who's an expert in bondage or whatever it happens to be, and I will introduce you to them so they can teach you what they have in their experience that I do not, so you have proper education.
For the benefit of the audience, which books?
Leather Sex Q&A by Master Joseph, and The Leatherman's Handbook by Guy Baldwin.
Okay.
I found them to be very useful, in the sense that Master Joseph, especially in his second book, was speaking from his experience as a columnist for Drummond. It wasn't him making up questions out of the ether. These were things people had actually sent in, issues they had actually formulated for themselves, which I'm sure resonated with a whole bunch of other people who were reading the book. So it was easier for other people to see, oh, somebody else feels this way too. Someone else has run into this issue, and what can I do effectively to learn about it and how to manage it and keep in balance? After those, it was just a question of learning the history of the leather community, learning that you were part of a community, and that you had brothers and sisters who would be there for you and understand your identity and support you.
How about more hands-on, working at various events? Anything like that?
I did not really have the opportunity to do much of that until after Trident Windy City came into being. Once that was done, my husband, John Schultz, and I were going to events in the Mid-America Conference of Clubs, network of clubs, going to Kansas City and Milwaukee, Twin Cities, St. Louis, and running into other people and getting a lot more participation in that way. Of course, the first thing I learned was that there's a multi-state network of leather and Levi clubs. It's been around since 1974. But this is perfect. Where's the history? I want to read the history. Oh, we don't have a written history. You don't say that to a librarian. You do not. So I started putting pieces together. By my own admission, I made a pain of myself for about 2 years, buttonholing people's runs and finding information and poking in people's trophy cases. But I pulled back an awful lot of information, otherwise it had never been written down. So when the word went out that something called the Leather Archives was going to be founded and formed, my first thought was, now wait a minute, I have to talk to these people, otherwise they're going to be going to talk to the same people I've been busy with for 2 years.
Let's come back to the Mid-America Conference of Clubs. That's
right.
That came first, yes? So,
right.
Yes?
No,
okay.
The Tridents came first, then MAC.
Okay.
Simply because the Tridents, if Trident Windy City had not formed, I would never have found the Mid-America Conference.
Okay. Hold on. Let's take a break for a second, because I think somewhere something got off kilter. Yeah, because I mean, it started going all over the place. Right. I want to get this correct, and it can be edited.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and move over to, do you want to talk about the founding of Trident Windy City first, and then talk about the work you did for MAC?
I have to, because that's the way it happened.
Okay, so just so we have this correct, and I'm not getting anything that looks bad when we're finally done. Okay. I'm going to pick it up then. I'll do the 3, 2, 1, and we'll pick it up with the question. Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1, pick up. You were one of, 3 people who helped found Trident Windy City. First of all, for people who don't know about that, would you please explain the group to an audience who may not know?
I'd be very glad to. The Trident International was born in Montreal, Canada in 1973. It was formed by a group of people who did not find what they needed in the other clubs of the city at the time, and they formed in the bar called the Neptune. And so they chose the sea god's trident as their symbol. Colors are red and black. They took as their slogan, "Give a damn," in the sense that if they're going to be in the community, they need to be contributing back to the community. They also wrote a Trident Creed, which was intended to be a statement of the world within which they would operate and how effective they would be. I didn't know anything about the Tridents until I went to my second run, which would be the Rodeo Riders Fall Run in December 1992 in Evanston.
Okay.
And I walked into the cocktail party, and there was a tall, red-haired, red-bearded bear standing there. I looked at him, he looked at me, and we growled. That was my husband, John. We were together for 5 years, but he was already an associate member of Trident Toledo. At that time, chapters of the Trident International existed from LA to New York to Florida and across the Midwest, Detroit and Toledo being the closest, but there had never been a chapter in Chicago. I think that was partly due to the fact that up to the end of the AIDS pandemic, all the other clubs in the city, if you will, were at carrying capacity. You had the Chicago Night, Pride, Motor City, I'm blanking on this. A whole bunch of other groups were in the city. But after the 1980s came through, many of those clubs no longer existed. So many people had died, they simply faded. So Chicago had space for a new group.
Okay.
And so when John came over, we brought the idea of the Tridents to the city, and we had our first bar night at Touche when Touche was in its present location before it started to move, then it went back to where it is now. And we started going to runs. And that's when we met all the other people from all the other MAC clubs, and that's how I learned about MAC. mainly
Okay.
from Peter Thomas, may he rest in peace, the former president of MAC.
Please explain what MAC is for the audience.
MACC stands for the Mid-America Conference of Clubs. It was founded in 1974 as a spinoff from the Atlantic Motorcycle Coordinating Council, which was the first multi-state leather club group in the United States.
Okay.
But the Tridents are interesting because they're the first international leather Levi club in North America. There
Okay.
are no longer any chapters in Canada. But the good part about them too was they were always open to both men and women. They didn't have presidents; they had halls of each chapter, and it was the second hall of Trident Toronto was a woman named Rose, and of course, and most of the chapters have gone through time. There have been a lot of women involved, so and to some degree, the Tridents have not had to deal with some of the issues that have come up in the leather community from time to time, because it's always been a brother and sisterhood.
Okay.
Which I think is the good thing about that. But MAC was formed so that clubs would have an adequate chance of coordinating events, not having 3 runs on the same weekend.
Yeah. Yeah.
And making sure everybody knew what was going on, and if there were certain issues that were coming up for the community as a whole to deal with, to serve as a forum for the Midwest. Originally, it reached all the way to Denver and to Omaha, but that turned out to be a little bit of a stretch. And eastward as far as Pittsburgh, but that was too far east as well. So the present boundaries would be Ohio to Minnesota to Iowa to Louisiana, and then southeast to Atlanta. But within that, that's an awful lot of land, and that's an awful lot of leather people.
Yes.
An awful lot of things going on. It's good to know there's a regional forum that you can talk things in. And these days, of course, we even do meetings with Zoom. We're up to date.
Yes. Yes. Tell us a little bit more about Trident. What sorts of things did Trident do?
Well, one of the major things we were always engaged with was to look for needs in the community, the gay community at large, in whatever city we were in, that were not being adequately met. What are local groups that we could help? An example from Chicago would be our assistance to the Broadway Youth Center, which helps gay and lesbian teens and other folks who've been kicked out of their houses. We did fundraising for them almost from day one, and they were very pleased to have us, and we've been in partnership with them for a long time. This is the give a damn ethic being carried out. That's the type of thing. Of course, we also had bar nights. We did runs, of course, and what we decided to do, at least Trident Windy City did, was to take Neptune as the name of our run, because nobody else in MAC was using it. And it's very pleased to know that this summer we will be celebrating our 30th year in existence.
Fantastic.
I think so. It's amazing. It seems like just yesterday, John and I were hosting the first bar night at Touche, and come this autumn, 30 years of Trident Windy City. Magnificent.
How is the membership at the moment?
Oh, we're very stable. We have a core group of about 10 people. We have a fair number of associates. Of course, like any other leather group, people come and people go, but we have a very capable hall. And the good part is I don't get to the city as much as I would like, but I can keep up via Zoom and text and that sort of thing. I do what I can, but I like to think after the first 5 years, when John had to go away for family business, we had capable people we had already trained to take over. So when he left, there was someone ready to step in and be the hall. Sadly, there never was another Tiffle. I was the founding first lady. Kind of nice. Although I held the line at wearing the pillbox hat with the veil.
Hey,
You have to have standards.
I have to wonder, 30 years, and you, as you mentioned, you cannot be as hands-on as you'd like to be anymore. How does it feel knowing that at some point or another you've got that step away from it?
It feels very healthy. for the simple reason that founding a club like that is bringing a new idea to a city where it had never existed before, and watching people come from the community who found this attractive and satisfying to them, and seeing people come over the years. That's what we always had in mind. This was never a private project of the three of us. And although I'm sad to report the third founder recently passed away, with Ed Luisi of Rodeo Riders. He was an associate Trident, so we had the three. But the idea was bring something new, send a legacy into the future that can continue to function for the community. Also, be adaptable in the sense, be open to both men and women, be willing to talk and try new things, and also be good with outreach to the community. And I like to think that what we've done very well. I'm very proud of Trident Windy City. Not just because they're in some ways my godchildren, but because they're living the idea that we've brought into being. And they've kept it alive at a time when some other clubs haven't done well and prospered.
That's true. Yeah.
And they're doing well in Chicago, and Chicago can be a turbulent town. But the Tridents always seem to be fairly laid back and cope with the situations as they arise. So yeah, I'm very proud of them.
That, of course, led you to many other steps in your journey.
It did.
One of them being the board of the Leather Archives and Museum.
Ah, yes.
Now, I know that out there are still people who are unfamiliar with the LA&M Leather Archives.
All right.
Would you please explain that first before you tell us how you came to be on the board?
I can best say that because the idea of the Leather Archives and Museum was something that was created by the late Chuck Renslow and the late Tony DeBlas. It was based on the idea that Chuck Renslow had a huge amount of artwork by his late partner, Eddie N., sitting in his basement.
Yes.
This was used as the core idea. There has to be an institution that will preserve the history of the leather community. Main institutions are not going to do it. Gay and lesbian archives, although they may wish as well, are not going to do it because they may find some of the books and magazines and other things a little too outre for their clientele. They might wind up having them, but they'll be in a locked file or something of that nature.
Yes.
So Chuck's idea was basically, let's create an institution of our own. Let's bring this into being. He put the call out, and as the creator of IML, he had a voice that would be listened to. And he summoned a whole group of people who were the original founders, the original board. He called women and men who were interested in doing this sort of thing and forging a new institution. People like Tony, people like Judy Tallwing. Now, so there were always men and women involved at the very beginning to forge what was going to happen. We had to find space, and he put the first space together in a building he owned right south of Vance Country. It was a storefront, it had plenty of security on it. And I worked there for a while. There was one big room with one big display case, and others around the walls, and one wired off area in the back for more perishable items. And that's where we all started. That space filled up incredibly because the word went out. Everybody loved the idea. But when they started donating things, they all had the idea, oh, you must want it. It's leather. It's old. Having done a lot of acquisitions in my time, I couldn't help thinking, oh my, well, let's see what they bring us. It wasn't a bad idea because there was no other place to put all this stuff. Renslow used to say that you couldn't very well go up to the attic and look at grandma's bondage gear or grandpa's leather, because if the families of these people found these things, they put them straight in the dumpster.
Yeah.
And the history
Yeah.
was associated with them went with it. So it was more the sense of create an institution where you're pulling stuff back, which was similar to what I had started to do with Mac and writing the history of the Tridents. Not that the groups had never existed, there was nothing written down. There was no legacy to be passed on. And then, of course, in due time, the word went out, we need to find a proper sized building. That was most of the 1990s. And we did finally find the present building we're in on Greenview Avenue. Then, of course, the problem came, we had to raise money to pay the mortgage. There were all sorts of events. I think the one I remember most vividly was the Shave the Bear campaign, where Joseph and one of my sons and a few other people literally had themselves shaved hairless, top to toe. But it brought in, I think, a large sum in the 5 figures, so it worked. But the international leather community worked together to raise the money, and we paid off the building. We paid off the mortgage, and we burned the mortgage, which I think was quite an accomplishment for an institution that maybe 10 years earlier hadn't even existed except as an idea in Chuck Renslow's mind.
Let's explain Chuck Renslow a little bit. Again, we can't assume that everyone's going to know who he was. The granddaddy of the
leather archives.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck was a consummate gay and lesbian leatherman and politician in the city of Chicago. He was the owner of the Gold Coast, which was the city's premier leather bar. After that came the Redoubt, of course, neither of which are around anymore. He knew how to navigate the politics of the city of Chicago very deftly, but he also knew how to organize a community and lead it in terms of proper leadership and events. As he used to say when he would get up on stage at IML, this is our annual leather family reunion, slightly dysfunctional. And you're laughing because I know you heard him say it too.
Oh, many times.
But of course, he was doing it tongue in cheek, because the fact that such an organization had come to being and the fact that we came from all over the world to be there proved it was anything but dysfunctional. But he also pushed for gay and lesbian rights in the city of Chicago to the degree that he could. He also pushed for more equitable wages. He did quite a large number of things, which is why I'm so glad someone did an excellent biography of him, because there was simply so much about him that could not be easily limited.
Right.
And
I did an interview with him myself, and I feel like I barely could scratch the surface.
I know the feeling.
So, but coming back to being a board member of the archives,
okay.
I know people are going to be very curious. They're going to want to know what goes into that. How does someone become a board member of the Leather Archives and Museum?
Well, I'll tell you how I did it, then I'll go on to answer the question more generally. The way I did it was simply to have come to Tony's attention by doing what I had done with the MAC and the Trident Histories. I was serving as a volunteer, then I was invited to be on the board for a 1-year term versus the 3-year term. That was in 2001. After a year, they said, hey, we like this kid, let's keep him around. That was a few years ago. But what we do now as members of the board, we're always looking for people who are, one, interested in sitting on the board and having some of the responsibility to keep the institution functioning, looking for people with skill sets that we don't have that we know we need. And over the years,
what would those be?
Well, it would depend on the issues involved. I think some of it would be public relations, financial management. We have an architect on the board at the moment. Also, we were looking to bring in more diversity onto the board. We have, at the moment, our present president of the archives is trans. We have people of color on the board. We have women on the board. Maybe not as many as we should or we could, but given the diversity of the community, we're at least trying to do something. And bring in people who can think toward the future. What would this place, should this place be in 10 years? What technologies are available that we're not using that we could for preservation? Someone who's good with writing grants, for example. It's a diversity. It's not an easy question to answer, but we're looking toward the future. At the same time, keep the archives responsive to the community around us, because the slogan of the archives used to be located in Chicago and serving the world. In a sense, we are still doing that. With the improvement of electronic technology, we can get more of our collections out so people elsewhere in the world really can utilize us, especially since we have an online catalog as well. I think it was always the sense that was a goal to be aspired to, and I think we're still aspiring to do as much of that as we can. But to actually become a board member, we do have a committee of the board that is always interested in being contacted. If someone wishes to say, I'd like to be on the board, contact the board, contact our president executive director, Gary Wasden. He'll pass the information along. They will get in touch with the person involved, find out who they are, what they're interested in, and then explain to them exactly what this would mean. How many meetings a year in Chicago, some virtual, some in reality, some of the issues that are involved, the standing committees of the board, because all of us sit on at least 2 or 3 committees. We're not just there to be decorative. And we do an awful lot of work ranging from writing grants to the most recent thing, which circles back to something we were talking about before, in terms of donations. It used to be if someone wanted to donate something to us, we had a donation form they would sign, and that was fine. Now we have put in place a new deed of gift form, which has just been approved. If someone wants to donate material to us now, we ask that they contact Mel Leverich, our archivist, and to find out what it is they want to give us. One example, we used to get people offering us sets of drummer all the time. We have drummer coming out our ears. Sometimes we can't fault them for wanting to help us, but some things we simply do not need anymore. So having something like this is a way of screening that's also more effective. One of the things I will be doing is passing that information along to the secretary of the Mid-America Conference, so all the people in the clubs know, if you want to do that, this is the procedure. This is how you do it. Because there will be people who have things they want to bring us. That's just the case, but I think it's more the case we're trying to be as adaptive as we can be, because we know we need to be to survive. So far, I think we've done a darn good job, and the fact that we have both straight and gay leather people and every other dimension of the community on that board, I think speaks very well for the fact we can all work together.
Yes.
And we do work together.
You're one of the only academics on the board, if maybe the only one.
No longer am I the only one. There was a time there when I was one of the few academics who was involved. And that had more to do with other people getting involved for a short time and then being called away by their professional lives. I settled in here about 65 miles west of Chicago in '81. I haven't left yet. So I was local, I was available. But by the same token, we were very pleased to be able to add Gail Rubin to the board recently. And Gail has a history in the community and her own research that goes all the way back to Samoa in San Francisco. And we have Robert Bienvenu, who's been involved with the MLA and a lot of other groups like that. So we have now 3 academics, in addition to Ed Mogul, our lawyer. Ed also teaches in the City College of Chicago. So there's always been academics there. We could always use more. But part of the problem is when you start researching this type of subject in academia, there were certain restrictions or hesitations about doing this sort of thing when you're not tenured. I'm hoping that that is less true now than it was years ago. But a lot of people simply don't want to risk it until they're tenured. I can't blame them either. They have to make their own decisions with where they are, what their institution is, degree of support they have or do not have. But yeah, there are academics out there who have read what we've written and have come to use our collection heavily. We now have a visiting scholar program where every year we put the word out and we have people coming from all over the world to do research there. And we ask that they send us a copy of whatever book they produce or they document. The most recent one I can think of that you may have seen is a book called Buying Gay. It's on the history of it's on the history of the physique magazines.
Oh,
And Don John, the person who wrote it, I'm not going to give his name, so I'll probably get it wrong. He came and he did his research with us in our collection. This is one of the few places that has a big enough set for him to do it. And he gave us a very nice write-up. So in the academic world, our name is becoming much more known. And the fact that we have resources sufficient now to do this type of scholarship outreach, I think is absolutely magnificent for an institution that began as a pile of artwork in Chuck Renslow's basement.
yes.
The odds against that kind of success are just huge.
But you mentioned a little earlier, there's a new procedure now for people to donate things to the archives. But you did some extraordinary work with things that Tony DeBlas donated. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes. After Tony was called, we got word from his partner, Andrew, that he was sending us Tony's stuff. That's all he said. I was sending you Tony's stuff. It turned out to be 72 boxes of stuff.
Wow.
24 of which were periodicals, because he had an editor of Drummer and Dungeon Master, and he had copies of I don't know how many years worth. So once incredible. We winnowed those out, I was faced with 48 boxes of stuff that Andrew had simply put together and shipped from Portland. Everything that had been Tony's, all the paperwork.
Oh my gosh.
And it was, I don't want to say it was a muddle, but it could have been a bit better organized. And Master Joseph was running the shop then. And having done similar work during my Peace Corps days, I said, I'll take this on and see what I can do to clean it up. I didn't know it was going to take 10 years.
My gosh.
That I would have said something on that line too if anybody had told me when I started how long it would take. But the problem was you didn't know what you were going to get in a box until you opened it.
Right.
Sometimes it was very easy to get through, sometimes not. I drafted some of my library friends in the city of Chicago for a while. One of them became an associate of Trident Windy City, as that happened. But you didn't know what you were going to get. The one I can remember most vividly is the day I opened a box and there was this cigar box inside. I had no idea what it was. It wasn't labeled. I opened it up. It was full of old poppers. Something like 8 or 10 bottles, no brands I'd ever seen before. My first thought was, oh my Lord. I went upstairs. I got Rick Storer, who was head of the shop then, said, Rick, you got to come see this. We're standing there looking at like, what do we do with this? We couldn't keep it, and heaven knows we couldn't open it. So what we did was take a sheet of white paper, lay the bottles out on them, photograph them to preserve the fact that these brands had once existed, and he injected something fatal with them. I never did know what, but we couldn't possibly have that sort of thing in the archives. Chemically unstable, and what if it leaked? And
wow,
so that was just amazing. But that was a typical Saturday.
Wow.
But eventually I had to rebuild his work with NLA. I had to sift all the stuff out on the Dungeon Master and Drummer. And eventually I wound up buying the file boxes they were stored in, buying the labels, because our budget at the archives was not sufficient. I was in a position to do it. So I figured I've come this far with it. We're not going to let this die. We're going to get this done. And eventually we did, so that when Mel came to work with us, I could hand this off to her and say, okay, I know it's not perfect, but this is what I've been able to do. And there was an awful lot of just plain junk. But most of it was looking from the inside of the life of one of the major figures in the leather community in North America. The thing I found most amusing was that he also put in personal ads. And he had saved all of the letters he got.
Oh my gosh.
And all of the pictures that came with the letters.
Fascinating.
I was bemused when I saw that. Like, okay, now what do we do with this? The other problem was we had a lot of photographs, things he had taken, things he had purchased from businesses like Marathon. What do we do with all these? How do we preserve them? These days it would be easy fairly to digitize them, but back then, what do we do to save these things so they don't dissolve and turn to paper and dust in 10 years? And that's part of the problem, the format of stuff that's donated to us.
Yeah.
Leather is durable, paper and film very often are not. One of the more unusual things I was able to retrieve was back when I was writing my columns on the letter clubs. I had a graduate student in geography at NIU come to me and say he'd seen something I'd written. He'd let me know he had been a member of Trade Winds, an old club from Chicago that was no more. And he had built a copy of their colors in stained glass. And I thought, well, this is wonderful, but I'm sure it's long gone. He found it in his bar. And he brought it to me, and I brought it to Rick.
Oh,
in the collection
great.
now.
Great.
You talk about retrieving stuff out of the bottom of the dustbin. I mean to tell you.
Yeah.
It's in, you never know what you're going to find. Oh, didn't Forrest Gump say something about that? Life being like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're going to get. The leather community hasn't got a patch on that.
When we were preparing for this chat, you told me that, of course, our late great-grandfather of the leather community, Chuck Renslow, taught you how the Salvation Army openly discriminates against LGBTQ people. Please tell us about that.
Well, when Chuck mentioned that to me, I thought, no, wait a minute, I've never heard that story before. And then he mentioned, oh, it was actually written up in the paper. But okay, I'm going to start digging. It turned out what had happened was the Chicago Night MC, which again is no more, participated for years in something called Toys for Tots, raising money every December for different charities.
Yes.
One New Year after the holidays were over, the president and the treasurer noticed that a check they had issued to the Salvation Army had never been cashed.
Yeah.
So they went down to Salvation Army Post headquarters to see what the problem was, because they wanted to close their books for the year. Well, it turned out that there had been a change in leadership at the Post. They were handed their check back, uncashed, and rather solidly informed that the Salvation Army did not wish to take donations from organizations like that. Predictably, when the word went out into the community, the whole community of the city was furious. And somehow the word came to the ears of a columnist, which I think you may have heard of, Mike Royko.
Yes.
Who used to write for the Sun-Times and elsewhere in the country. By a fair amount of digging, I found the column that he wrote on this whole issue. He dedicated an entire column in the Sun-Times to this event, and he lambasted the Salvation Army.
Good.
His best comment, I think, was something on the order of, if the Salvation Army is going to be so particular about where they get their money, they can use their kettles to make soup.
Yeah.
And I spun that story into an article I wrote called "When Leather Made the Papers: The Tale of the Windy City." I used it as an example of how easily a piece of history can just slip off the radar and vanish. Because if Chuck hadn't told me that story, I would never have heard it. I would never have gone hunting.
Yeah.
And I did check to see Royko's columns were reprinted in book form later. That column was not. I don't know why.
Oh, I can guess.
We can possibly guess, but we can't prove it. So I would hesitate to say why.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many other columns other than that one were also not there.
Yeah.
There's no way to tell, but that was how Chuck set me on the trail of a story that I actually literally managed to pull out of the dustbin. And who knew I was going to wind up reading Mike Royko in the process?
Why not? You know?
Why not, indeed? And he had a lot of good things to say. It's right on for you.
But what advice can you offer academics, researchists, anyone who wants to come to the leather kink community in the archives? What advice have you for them?
Well, the first thing I would say is you will be met with open arms. You'll all be very welcome. The second thing I would tell them to do is look at our website. You'll be able to get a very clear picture of the types of collections we hold: visual, sound, paper, and artifactual. We have clear reporting lines as to if you want to come to us, let us know. If you need housing, when you want to come, what you want to do. Researching in the collections is not limited to the people who come as visiting scholars. We are open to anyone who wants to come and use our collections. That's why Mel and the others need to let us know what you need, because sometimes people may have wonderful ideas. This has happened more than once over the years, where they think we'll have something, and sometimes we're not the best place for them to go. Maybe the Kinsey can do better.
Yeah.
Maybe the Gay and Lesbian Archives in San Francisco has more of what they need.
Yeah.
But if they can let us know up to that point, we can certainly steer them in the right direction. Because there's no point in having them come and spend a week with us and go home and say, well, I wasted a whole week. They didn't have anything that I needed. If we can stop that from happening, we try. That goes back to what Mel was saying with the new deeded gift form. We have to do a fair amount of screening, so we're not setting people up to fail.
Right. Exactly.
By the same token, if they come with one idea, they may see something that we have here that will spark a whole new line of research. So from wherever they come, from whatever hemisphere, we stand ready to welcome them.
Now, how do you want to be remembered by the community?
I think I'd like to be remembered as a historian, as one of the founders of Trident Windy City. I'd like to be remembered as a member of Master Alex Kepler's household. And I'd like to be remembered as the man who had 4 fine leather sons.
That's beautiful.
All of whom I am still very proud of, even though none of them is above ground any longer.
Yeah. What's the biggest misconception about you?
Oh dear. Biggest misconception about me, I think, if I had to pick one, it would probably be that I'm not as aware of what's going on in the community because of where I live. Make no mistake, we have people. I try to keep up with what's going on in the community as much as I can, and also to bring the skills that I have and the experiences that I've had to bear on the problems of the future. One I can think of just off the top of my head is, at some point, we're going to have to preserve the back set of the leather journal. It's never been microfilmed. It's never been digitized, except maybe if they have something in-house in California.
Wow, I did not know that.
Now you do. I would be more than happy to be corrected on this, but I've never heard of anywhere that's digitized the leather journal.
Oh boy.
In fact, my brother Steve Linnaeus and I have been discussing what can be done in that way, because nowadays digitizing stuff's a lot easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
A lot cheaper. But to my knowledge, I want to qualify that. I'm sure they have digital material on each issue that they preserve in the offices in California. That said, I don't know of any library or institution that has a digital set of the leather journal available for searching. And there needs to be more than one set of it if it's ever created, sprinkled around the planet. So if something happens, we need to have copies. But at the moment, if you want to do research in a leather journal, you're going to have to do it page by page. This gets back to me and my 12 and a half drawers of file cards with the Advocate Index. And I have stood my watch. I'm not doing that.
That's fair.
Although Steve did say that there's software now that you can do a lot of the busy work with a computer rather than having to sit there on early mornings turning the microfilm reels and one by one. Technology has brought us along, but that is something long term that's going to have to be done because there's too much information that's in that periodical that is not what else.
Yes. Well, Rob Rittinger, I would like to thank you for a fascinating interview for Inside Leather History, a Fireside Chat.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed being had.
Oh, did I?
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the Fireside Chat channel for more chapters in the history of leather. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe.